The church bells had already stopped ringing when Eleanor Winslow realized something was wrong. She stood at the top of the aisle, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm, and looked toward the altar where a man was supposed to be waiting for her. The space where he should have stood was empty. Whispers moved through the crowded pews like a cold draft under a door. Eleanor kept her chin high, though her heart had begun to hammer so hard she feared everyone could hear it. Her father leaned close and murmured that perhaps the groom had simply been delayed. She wanted to believe him. She had wanted to believe a great many things that morning. The minister glanced toward the side door for the third time, his expression shifting from patience to concern. Guests began to turn in their seats, craning their necks to look behind them, as if the missing groom might come rushing in through the church doors with some breathless excuse. No one came. Eleanor's gaze swept across the crowd. She saw her aunt pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. She saw two young cousins giggling behind their gloved hands, not yet old enough to understand what humiliation felt like. She saw, near the back, a tall man in a dark coat who was not looking away from her the way everyone else seemed to be. He was watching her directly, his face unreadable, and something about his steady attention made her feel, for one strange moment, less alone. She did not know his name. She only knew he was a guest of the groom's family, someone important enough to be seated near the front rows, though he had chosen to sit farther back, closer to the door. Later she would learn he was the Duke of Carradine. In that moment he was simply a stranger who did not flinch when everyone else seemed to be holding their breath. A messenger arrived at last, slipping through the side door and speaking in a low voice to the minister. The minister's face changed. He turned to Eleanor's father with visible reluctance, and the words that followed traveled through the church faster than any voice could carry them. The groom would not be coming. He had left the city that morning. There would be no wedding. The silence that followed was worse than any gasp could have been. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move. She had spent months preparing for this day, months practicing smiles for portraits and fittings for a dress that now felt like a costume, for a play that had been canceled without warning. She had believed, with the foolish certainty of a woman in love, that today would be the beginning of her life, not the day her life fell apart in front of 300 witnesses. She did not cry. She would not give the room that satisfaction. Instead, she turned to her father and asked him, quietly, to take her home. He nodded, too stunned to argue, and together they walked back down the aisle they had just walked up, past faces that no longer bothered to hide their pity or their curiosity. Eleanor kept her eyes forward the entire way, though she could feel the stranger's gaze following her, until she passed through the doors and out into the gray daylight. The carriage ride home was silent, except for the sound of wheels on cobblestones. Eleanor stared out the window at the city she had lived in her whole life, a city that would talk about this morning for weeks, perhaps months. By evening, every drawing room in London would know her name and her disgrace. She thought of the letters that would be written, the invitations that would quietly stop arriving, the whispers that would follow her into every ballroom she dared to enter again. She made her decision before the carriage even reached her father's house. She would not stay to hear the whispers. She would not sit in her family's parlor accepting sympathetic visits from women who secretly delighted in her misfortune. She thought of her aunt's old estate in the countryside, a house called Ashcombe that had stood empty since her aunt's death 2 years earlier. It was remote, unfashionable, and far enough from London that no one would think to look for her there. It was exactly what she needed. Her father tried to talk her out of it that evening, sitting across from her in his study with a glass of brandy he had not touched. He told her that running away would only give people more to talk about, that she should hold her head high and let London see she was unbothered. Eleanor almost laughed at that. She was not unbothered. She was shattered, and pretending otherwise in front of an audience sounded like its own kind of misery. Her father was a practical man, more comfortable with figures and business than with comforting a heartbroken daughter, and Eleanor could see he did not know what to say to make things right. He offered to send a letter to the Fairweather family demanding an explanation. He offered to hire men to find out where Edmund had gone. None of it would undo what had already happened in front of half of London, and Eleanor told him so as gently as she could manage. What she needed was not answers or apologies. What she needed was distance, enough of it that she could breathe again without feeling every eye in the city upon her. He relented eventually, as she had known he would, though he made her promise to write every week and to return the moment she wished to. She agreed easily, knowing even as she said it that she had no intention of returning soon. There was nothing left in London for her now except pity dressed up as concern, and she had had quite enough of that to last a lifetime. She left 2 days later, before the sun had fully risen, taking only a small trunk of belongings and her lady's maid, a young woman named Beatrice who had been with the family since Eleanor was a child. The journey to Ashcombe took the better part of 2 days, along roads that grew narrower and quieter the farther they traveled from the city. Eleanor watched the countryside change through the carriage window, fields replacing streets, hedgerows replacing townhouses, and felt something in her chest loosen with every mile. By the time they arrived, the light was fading into a soft amber dusk. Ashcombe stood at the end of a long gravel drive, its stone walls covered in ivy that had grown wild and untended since her aunt's passing. The windows were dark, the gardens overgrown, but there was something peaceful about its neglect, as though the house itself had been waiting quietly for someone to return to it. Beatrice looked doubtful as they stepped down from the carriage. She asked if Eleanor was certain about this, staying in a house so far from everything she knew. Eleanor looked up at the dark windows and felt, for the first time since the church, something close to relief. No one here knew her name. No one here had watched her stand alone at the altar. Here, she could simply be a woman living quietly in the countryside, and that thought, more than anything else, gave her the strength to walk through the front door. The inside of the house smelled of dust and old wood, but beneath the neglect, Eleanor could see the bones of a home that had once been loved. She wandered through the rooms that evening with a single candle, running her fingers along furniture draped in white cloth, remembering visits here as a child, when her aunt had let her run through the gardens and eat cake in the kitchen before dinner. It felt strange to be back under such different circumstances, a grown woman fleeing her own wedding instead of a child chasing butterflies through the hedges. She chose a bedroom on the second floor that overlooked the back gardens, a room with faded blue curtains and a view of a small pond that had once held swans. She sat by the window long after Beatrice had gone to prepare the rest of the house, watching the last light disappear over the trees, and allowed herself, finally, alone and unseen, to cry. She thought of the morning before the wedding, when she had still believed her future was settled. She remembered sitting at her dressing table while Beatrice pinned flowers into her hair, laughing at some small joke, unaware that within hours, the life she had planned would collapse in front of everyone she knew. She remembered her mother's voice, gone now these 3 years, telling her once that a good marriage was built on trust, not just affection. Eleanor had trusted completely. She had never once imagined that trust could be repaid with silence and an empty road out of the city. She thought, too, of the groom himself, a man named Edmund Fairweather, whom she had known since she was 17. He had courted her patiently, had written her letters full of warm promises, had knelt in her father's garden to ask for her hand. None of it had prepared her for a man who could vanish without a single word of explanation, leaving her to learn of his absence from a stranger's whispered message at the altar. She wondered if he was even now sitting somewhere safe, untouched by scandal, while she was the one who would carry the weight of that morning for the rest of her life. It struck her as deeply unfair, the way the world seemed to forgive men so easily for the very things it never forgave in women. The tears did not last long. Eleanor was not a woman who wallowed easily, and by the time she wiped her face and climbed into the unfamiliar bed, she had already begun to plan. She would stay here through the autumn, perhaps longer. She would write to no one except her father, and only when necessary. She would let London forget her, the way it forgot every scandal eventually, once a fresher one came along to take its place. She did not know, as she drifted into an exhausted sleep that first night, that she had been watched leaving London. She did not know that the tall stranger from the back of the church, the man who had not looked away when everyone else had asked quiet questions about where the Winslow family kept their country properties. She did not know that within the week, a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest would turn onto the same gravel drive she had traveled that evening, carrying a man with answers she did not yet know she needed. For now, there was only the quiet of Ashcombe, the sound of wind moving through ivy outside her window, and the strange, fragile peace of a woman who believed, for one night at least, that she had finally escaped. Eleanor woke on her first morning at Ashcombe to the sound of birdsong instead of city traffic, and for a few peaceful seconds, before memory returned, she almost forgot why she was there. Then it came back all at once, the empty altar, the whispers, the long road out of London, and she lay still for a moment, letting the weight of it settle before she made herself rise. The house looked different in daylight. Sunlight poured through windows that had been dark and unwelcoming the night before, revealing rooms that were dusty but full of quiet charm. Beatrice had already begun opening curtains and airing out linens, moving through the halls with the brisk efficiency of a woman determined to make the best of an unusual situation. Eleanor found her in the kitchen, coaxing a fire to life in a hearth that had not been used in months. Over the following days, the two women worked to bring the house back to life. They aired out bedrooms, uncovered furniture, swept floors that had gathered dust since Eleanor's aunt had passed. Eleanor found herself grateful for the labor. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, leaving less room for the thoughts that crept in whenever she was still for too long. She discovered old letters in a writing desk, faded ribbons in a trunk, a garden gone wild with roses that had grown far beyond their beds. Each discovery felt like uncovering a small piece of a life that had nothing to do with the one she had left behind. She began taking walks each morning through the estate grounds, following paths that wound past the old pond and into a small stretch of woodland at the edge of the property. The air smelled of damp earth and autumn leaves, and the quiet of it was unlike anything she had known in London, where even the nights were filled with the sound of carriages and distant voices. Here there was only birdsong, wind moving through branches, and the occasional bleat of sheep from a neighboring farm. She had not realized how loud her old life had been until she experienced the absence of it. The villagers nearby knew little about her, and Eleanor preferred to keep it that way. She introduced herself simply as Miss Winslow, a relation of the estate's late owner come to see to the property, and left it at that. The local shopkeeper, a kind older woman named Margaret, asked no prying questions, though her eyes were curious enough. Eleanor bought bread and tea and small necessities, exchanged pleasant but brief conversation, and returned to Ashcombe each time feeling a little more like herself, or perhaps like a new version of herself entirely. She wrote to her father as promised, brief letters assuring him she was well and the house was in good condition. She did not mention how often she thought of the church, or how she still sometimes woke expecting to hear wedding preparations happening downstairs before remembering there was no wedding to prepare for. Some wounds, she had learned, healed more slowly in private than they ever could in front of an audience pretending to sympathize. It was on the 6th day, just as Eleanor was beginning to believe she had truly found peace, that the sound of carriage wheels on gravel broke the quiet of the afternoon. She was in the garden, cutting roses with a pair of old shears she had found in the shed, and she straightened at the sound, certain she had misheard. No one came to Ashcombe. No one knew she was there, save her father and Beatrice's sister, who managed correspondence for the household staff back in London. She walked around the side of the house in time to see an unfamiliar carriage rolling to a stop at the end of the drive, its dark wood polished and its crest unfamiliar to her at first glance. Her heart began to beat faster, not with fear exactly, but with the sharp unease of a person whose careful hiding place had just been discovered. She set down the shears and smoothed her skirts, bracing herself for whoever might step down from the carriage. The door opened and a man stepped out into the afternoon light, tall and composed, dressed in the fine dark coat of a gentleman who had traveled some distance but had not let the journey disturb his bearing. It took Eleanor a moment to place him, and when she did, her breath caught. It was the stranger from the back of the church, the man who had watched her walk out of her own wedding without looking away. He introduced himself as she approached, his voice calm and measured, as though arriving unannounced at a stranger's remote estate was the most natural thing in the world. He was Julian Ashford, Duke of Carradine, a guest of the Fairweather family and, as it happened, a distant acquaintance of her father through business dealings some years past. Eleanor recognized the name now that she heard the title attached to it. She had heard him spoken of before, always with a note of respect mixed with curiosity. A man known for keeping his own counsel and rarely appearing at the social gatherings that consumed the rest of the nobility. She asked him plainly, without bothering to soften the question, what he was doing at her aunt's estate, nearly 2 days' journey from London. He answered just as plainly, telling her he had come because there was something she deserved to know, something about the circumstances of the wedding that had not been made clear to her that day at the church. Eleanor felt a flash of anger rise in her chest. She had spent 6 days trying to forget that morning, and here was a man she barely knew, arriving unannounced to drag her back into it. She told him she had no interest in hearing anything more about Edmund Fairweather, or his reasons for abandoning her in front of half of London. She had already endured enough humiliation without needing a stranger to explain it further. Carradine listened to her without interrupting, his expression patient rather than offended, and when she finished, he simply said that he understood her anger, but that what he had to tell her was not about excusing Edmund's behavior. It was about protecting her from what might come next. That gave her pause, despite herself. She studied him for a long moment, trying to read whatever lay beneath his calm exterior, but his face gave little away beyond quiet sincerity. She was not sure she trusted him, not sure she trusted any man who claimed to have her interests at heart after the events of the past week. But there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that made her hesitate before turning him away entirely. Beatrice appeared at the edge of the garden, drawn by the sound of the carriage, and looked between Eleanor and the unfamiliar Duke with poorly concealed curiosity. Eleanor was aware of how strange the scene must appear. A duke standing in an overgrown garden speaking to a woman who was supposed to be hiding from society, and she felt a fresh wave of frustration at having her careful solitude disturbed so quickly. She told Carradine she would give him a quarter of an hour, no more, and led him not into the house but to a stone bench near the pond, unwilling to invite a stranger into the fragile sanctuary she had only just begun to build indoors. He seemed to understand her reluctance and did not press for more than she offered. He sat at the far end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance, and began to speak. He told her that he had known Edmund Fairweather for several years, not as a close friend but as an acquaintance moving in the same circles, and that in the weeks before the wedding he had heard troubling rumors about debts Edmund owed to men who were not known for their patience. He explained that he had not thought much of it at first, assuming it was the usual gossip that followed any young man of fortune, until the morning of the wedding itself, when he had seen Edmund leaving the city in a hired carriage hours before the ceremony was meant to begin, accompanied by two men Carradine did not recognize and did not like the look of. Eleanor listened with a growing sense of unease, her earlier anger giving way to something colder and more unsettling. She asked him what he believed had truly happened, and Carradine admitted he did not know for certain, only that Edmund's disappearance did not look like the actions of a man simply losing his nerve. It looked, he said carefully, like the actions of a man running from something far more serious than doubts about marriage. She sat in silence for a long moment, watching the surface of the pond ripple gently in the afternoon breeze, turning his words over in her mind. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as idle speculation, the kind of story a man might invent for reasons of his own. But another part of her, the part that had spent the wedding morning searching every face in that church for some explanation, could not ignore how much sense it made. Edmund's silence, his absence, the complete lack of any letter or message, even a cruel one, to explain himself. A man fleeing debts, or worse, would have every reason to vanish without a word, leaving the woman he had promised to marry, to face the consequences alone. She asked Carradine why he had come all this way to tell her this himself, rather than simply writing a letter or speaking to her father instead. He was quiet for a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before, less measured. He told her that he had watched her stand at that altar with more composure than most people could manage, and that it had seemed wrong to let her hear the truth secondhand, filtered through other voices with their own opinions and judgments attached. She deserved, he said, to hear it plainly, from someone who had seen it happen. Eleanor did not know what to make of that answer. It was not the response of a man simply performing a duty, yet she could not quite believe it was anything more than concern for a stranger's dignity. She thanked him for the information, though her voice remained guarded, and told him she needed time to consider what he had said. Carradine nodded, rising from the bench without pressing further, and told her he had taken rooms at the inn in the nearby village for a few days, should she wish to speak with him again before he returned to London. She watched him walk back toward his carriage, his tall figure cutting a strange and unwelcome silhouette against the quiet backdrop of Ashcombe's gardens, and felt the fragile peace she had built over the past 6 days crack just slightly at the edges. Whatever she had hoped to leave behind in London, it seemed it had followed her here after all, carried by a man she barely knew but could not quite bring herself to distrust entirely. That night, she sat by her window long after Beatrice had gone to bed, staring out at the dark shape of the pond, and turning Carradine's words over and over in her mind. Somewhere in London, Edmund Fairweather was hiding from something, and she had been left to carry the shame of his disappearance without ever knowing the real reason behind it. She did not yet know what she intended to do with that knowledge, only that she could no longer pretend the world outside Ashcombe's walls did not exist. The quiet she had found here suddenly felt more fragile than she had realized, and for the first time since arriving, she found herself wondering what the coming days would bring. Eleanor did not sleep well that night, and by morning she had made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She would speak to Carradine again, not because she trusted him fully, but because the questions he had raised refused to leave her alone. She dressed simply, told Beatrice she was walking into the village, and set off down the road with the autumn wind pulling at her cloak. The village inn was small and modest, the kind of place travelers stopped for a night before continuing on to somewhere more important. Eleanor found Carradine in the small dining room, seated near the window with a cup of tea going cold in front of him, as though he had been waiting for her longer than he cared to admit. He rose the moment he saw her, pulling out a chair across from his own, and waited until she had settled before speaking. She told him plainly that she had thought about what he said, and that she wanted to know more, not because she believed him entirely, but because she could not continue pretending the questions did not exist. Carradine studied her for a moment, as though weighing how much to share, and then began speaking more openly than he had the day before. He told her that Edmund's debts were not the ordinary kind accumulated at card tables among gentlemen. They belonged to a man named Victor Langley, a merchant with connections that stretched well beyond respectable business, a man known in certain circles for lending money to desperate young men of good family, and then using that debt as leverage for far less honorable purposes. Carradine explained that he had heard whispers, nothing confirmed, that Edmund had been asked to do something in exchange for forgiveness of his debt, something involving information about shipping contracts that Edmund's own family held influence over. Eleanor sat very still as she listened, her tea untouched, trying to reconcile this version of Edmund with the man she had known for 3 years. The Edmund she remembered had been charming, a little careless with money perhaps, but never the sort of man she would have imagined, tangled up in dealings serious enough to make him flee his own wedding. Yet the more Carradine spoke, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She asked him how he had come to know so much about a matter that seemed, on the surface, to have nothing to do with him. Carradine hesitated before answering, and when he did, his voice carried a weight she had not heard in him before. He told her that his own family had once suffered under Langley's influence, years earlier, when Carradine was still young, and his father had made the mistake of borrowing money from the wrong man during a difficult season. It had cost his family dearly, both in fortune and in reputation, and Carradine had spent years afterward making certain he understood exactly how men like Langley operated, so that he would never again be caught unprepared by such dealings. There was something raw beneath his composed exterior when he spoke of it, a controlled anger that told Eleanor this was not simply gossip to him. It was personal. She found herself studying him differently after that, seeing not just a duke who had appeared uninvited at her hiding place, but a man who understood, in his own way, what it meant to have one's life upended by forces beyond his control. She asked him what he thought she should do with this information, now that she had it. Carradine admitted he did not have a simple answer. He told her that confronting Edmund directly could be dangerous, not because Edmund himself posed a threat, but because men like Langley did not appreciate their business being exposed. He suggested, carefully, that the wisest course might be patience, allowing more information to surface naturally before deciding on any action, rather than rushing back to London and stirring a situation that was already dangerous enough without her involvement. Eleanor felt a flash of frustration at that suggestion. She had spent her whole life being told to wait patiently, to trust that men with more knowledge and authority would handle matters on her behalf, and look where that patience had gotten her, standing alone at an altar in front of 300 witnesses. She told him, more sharply than she intended, that she was tired of being protected from the truth of her own life. If there was danger involved, she wanted to understand it clearly, not have it filtered through careful half-explanations meant to spare her feelings. Carradine seemed almost surprised by the force of her response, and after a moment, something in his expression shifted into what looked like respect. He told her she was right to want the full truth, and that he had not meant to condescend, only to be careful with information that could put her at risk if handled carelessly. He offered to tell her everything he knew, in full, if she was certain that was what she wanted. She told him she was certain, and for the next hour, in the quiet dining room of the village inn, he laid out everything he had learned. He spoke of shipping contracts belonging to Edmund's family that granted access to certain trade routes along the coast, routes that Langley apparently wished to control for reasons that went beyond ordinary commerce. He spoke of whispers involving smuggled goods, of customs officials paid to look away, of a network far larger and more dangerous than a simple debt between two men. Edmund, it seemed, had been caught in the middle, asked to use his family's influence to grant access Langley needed, and when he had hesitated or perhaps tried to refuse, the pressure had apparently grown severe enough that he chose to disappear entirely, rather than face either his creditor or his bride. Eleanor absorbed all of this with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. It was almost easier, in a way, to imagine Edmund as simply a coward who had lost his nerve, than to imagine him tangled in something this serious, something that might still be unfolding even now while she sat safely in the countryside. She asked Carradine if he believed Edmund was in danger himself, and Carradine admitted he did not know, though he suspected that was precisely why Edmund had vanished so completely, leaving no letter and no explanation even to the woman he was meant to marry. A man running from ordinary embarrassment might have written some apology eventually. A man running for his safety might not dare to leave any trace at all. The conversation left Eleanor feeling unsteady in a way she had not expected. She had come to the inn braced for information that might explain Edmund's betrayal, perhaps even confirm that he was simply a weak and selfish man unworthy of her grief. Instead, she found herself uncertain whether to feel anger toward him or something closer to concern, despite everything he had put her through. It was a complicated tangle of feelings she did not particularly want to examine too closely, not with Carradine watching her so carefully from across the table. She asked him, finally, what he intended to do with this knowledge himself. Carradine told her he had already made some quiet inquiries through connections he trusted, men who might be able to confirm whether Edmund was still in the country or had fled abroad, and whether Langley's operations were being watched by anyone with the authority to intervene. He told her he did not intend to let the matter simply disappear, both because he believed Edmund deserved whatever consequences came from his choices, and because he did not like the idea of a woman like Eleanor carrying the public shame of an abandonment that had far more complicated roots than anyone in London would ever know. Something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, made Eleanor look at him more closely. She had spent the last week assuming that anyone who involved themselves in her situation was doing so out of curiosity, or perhaps some misguided sense of duty toward a family acquaintance. But there was nothing in Carradine's tone that suggested idle curiosity. He spoke like a man who had decided something mattered to him, and did not intend to abandon it simply because it would have been easier to walk away. She thanked him again for his honesty, though she found herself uncertain what to do next with everything he had told her. He suggested, gently, that she take whatever time she needed to consider her next steps, and offered to remain in the village a while longer, in case she wished to discuss the matter further, or in case new information arrived that she should know about immediately. She agreed, though she made clear she was not inviting him to Ashcombe itself, unwilling to let her fragile sanctuary become a meeting place for London's troubles to follow her into the countryside so easily. Walking back to the estate that afternoon, Eleanor found her thoughts circling endlessly around everything she had learned. She thought of the danger Edmund might be facing, wherever he was hiding, and felt an unwelcome pang of worry despite her anger toward him. She thought of Langley, a man she had never met, but whose shadow now seemed to stretch uncomfortably close to her own quiet life. And she thought, more than she expected to, of Carradine himself, a man who had traveled 2 days out of his way to make certain she knew the truth, and who seemed determined to see the matter through, rather than simply delivering his warning and returning to his own affairs in London. On the walk home, she passed the small stone bridge that crossed the stream marking the edge of the estate's boundary, and she paused there a moment, watching the water move quickly over smooth stones below. She thought of how different this landscape was from the crowded streets of London, how easy it had been, in the space of a single week, to convince herself that distance alone could keep the past from reaching her. Carradine's arrival had proven otherwise, and she found herself wondering, with some discomfort, what else might follow him here, if she was not careful. She thought too of her father, still in London, unaware of everything she had just learned. She considered whether she owed him a letter explaining the danger that might now surround the Fairweather name, and by extension, anyone closely associated with it. Yet she hesitated at the thought of putting any of this into writing, uncertain how much could be trusted to paper when the matter involved men willing to threaten a young gentleman into fleeing his own wedding. Perhaps, she decided, it was better to wait until she understood more clearly what she was dealing with before drawing her father into a situation that might prove more dangerous than either of them realized. As she continued down the lane toward Ashcombe, she found her thoughts returning, almost against her will, to the way Carradine had spoken of his own family's history with Langley. There had been something unguarded in his voice during that part of the conversation, a rare crack in the composed exterior he otherwise maintained so carefully. She wondered what it had cost his family, exactly, and whether that experience explained why he seemed so determined to see this matter through rather than simply washing his hands of it once his warning had been delivered. It was a strange thing, to find herself curious about a man she had known for less than 2 days, especially given everything else occupying her mind, yet the curiosity persisted regardless. She noticed, too, a change in how she thought of Edmund now. The anger she had carried since the moment she stood alone at that altar had not disappeared, but it had shifted, softened at the edges by the possibility that his disappearance had not been simple cowardice after all. She was not yet ready to forgive him, if forgiveness was even the right word for what she felt, but she found she could no longer picture him as purely a villain in her own story. He had made choices that hurt her deeply, whatever his reasons, and she reminded herself firmly that understanding his circumstances did not excuse the silence he had left her to endure in front of all of London. Still, the complexity of it all sat uneasily in her chest, refusing to resolve itself into anything as simple as the anger she had nursed over the past week. By the time she reached Ashcombe, the sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown gardens she had only just begun to tame. Beatrice met her at the door, full of questions about where she had been for so long, and Eleanor gave only vague answers, not yet ready to explain everything that had unfolded in the village that day. She retreated to her room instead, sitting once again by the window that overlooked the pond, and allowed herself finally to think clearly about everything Carradine had told her. She realized, somewhat reluctantly, that she could no longer think of her broken engagement as a simple story of a coward abandoning his bride. It had become something far more complicated, tangled up with danger and secrecy, and a man she barely knew who seemed determined to help her make sense of it all. Whatever peace she had found at Ashcombe over the past week now felt fragile in a new way, not because her hiding place had been discovered, but because the world she had fled from had turned out to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Beatrice brought a tray of supper up to her room that evening, sensing correctly that Eleanor was not yet ready for conversation, and set it quietly on the small table near the window before withdrawing. Eleanor picked at the food without much appetite, her mind too occupied to notice what she was eating. She found herself replaying the conversation at the inn again and again, searching for details she might have missed, questions she should have asked while she had the chance. She thought about Langley, this man she had never met, whose influence apparently reached far enough to frighten a young gentleman into abandoning his own wedding rather than face him. She wondered how many other families had suffered under similar circumstances, quietly, without anyone in society ever learning the true reasons behind sudden disappearances or broken engagements or ruined fortunes. It struck her as deeply unsettling, the idea that such danger could exist just beneath the polished surface of London society, hidden behind respectable addresses and fashionable dinner parties, while everyone continued their lives unaware of what moved in the shadows around them. She thought, too, about what it might mean for her own safety, now that she possessed knowledge that Carradine himself had described as dangerous. If Langley's reach was as far as Carradine suggested, could word eventually travel that she had learned the truth behind Edmund's disappearance? She was not certain how much comfort to take from Ashcombe's remote location, given how easily Carradine himself had managed to find her here. The thought sent an uncomfortable chill through her, and she found herself glancing toward her bedroom window, half expecting to see some unfamiliar shape moving in the darkness beyond the glass, though of course there was nothing there but the quiet shapes of trees swaying gently in the evening wind. She reminded herself firmly that fear would not serve her well, not now, and that Carradine had promised to make careful inquiries rather than acting rashly. She would have to trust, for the time being, that his caution was genuine, and that whatever came next would come with enough warning for her to prepare herself properly. It was not a comfortable thought, trusting a man she had known for such a short time with something so important, but she found she had little choice in the matter. Not when the alternative was facing everything alone, with no one in the countryside who understood the true shape of the danger surrounding her. She did not yet know what she intended to do with that knowledge, only that there would be no simply forgetting it. Not now, not after everything she had learned that afternoon in the quiet dining room of a village inn 2 days from London. 3 days passed at Ashcombe with no word from Carradine, and Eleanor found herself caught between relief and an unexpected restlessness she did not care to examine too closely. She kept to her usual routine, tending the garden, walking the woodland paths, sitting with Beatrice in the evenings over mending and quiet conversation, yet her thoughts drifted constantly back to the village inn and everything she had learned there. On the 4th morning a letter arrived by messenger, sealed with an unfamiliar crest she now recognized as Carradine's own. Eleanor opened it in the privacy of her room, her hands not quite steady as she unfolded the paper. His handwriting was neat and controlled, much like the man himself, and the message was brief. He had received word from his contacts in London. Edmund Fairweather had been found, alive and unharmed, though the circumstances of his discovery raised more questions than they answered. Carradine asked if he might call on her that afternoon to explain further, promising he would not overstay his welcome. She sent Beatrice with a reply agreeing to the visit, then spent the following hours in a state of nervous anticipation she found faintly embarrassing. She told herself it was simply the natural response to receiving important news, nothing more, though she caught herself glancing toward the window every few minutes, watching for the first sign of his carriage on the drive. He arrived just after 2 in the afternoon, and this time Eleanor invited him into the house itself, leading him to the small sitting room she had begun to restore to some semblance of comfort. She had lit a fire against the autumn chill, and the warm light softened the room's remaining shabbiness into something almost cozy. Carradine took the seat she offered, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. He told her that Edmund had been discovered in a small coastal town, staying under a false name at a modest inn, apparently attempting to arrange passage on a ship bound for the continent. Carradine's contacts had managed to speak with him briefly before he could disappear again, and what Edmund had revealed confirmed much of what Carradine had already suspected. He had indeed been pressured by Langley to use his family's shipping influence to grant access to certain trade routes, and when he had tried to delay or refuse, the threats against him had grown severe enough that he believed his life was genuinely at risk. Rather than face Langley or explain the truth to Eleanor and her family, he had chosen to disappear entirely, believing it was the only way to protect both himself and, in some twisted way, Eleanor as well, reasoning that distancing himself from her would keep her safe from any retaliation. Eleanor absorbed this with a complicated mixture of feelings. Part of her wanted to feel sympathy for a man who had genuinely believed himself in danger, yet another part of her could not forgive the manner in which he had handled it, vanishing without a single word, rather than trusting her enough to explain, even briefly, that something was wrong. She said as much to Carradine, her voice sharper than she intended, and he nodded slowly, agreeing that whatever fear Edmund had felt did not excuse the cruelty of leaving her to face that humiliation alone, without any explanation at all. She asked what would happen to Edmund now, and Carradine admitted the situation remained unresolved. His contacts had encouraged Edmund to return to London and speak with the proper authorities about Langley's activities, though Edmund remained frightened enough that he had not yet agreed to any such plan. Carradine believed it was only a matter of time before Langley's operations drew official attention regardless, given how many other families had likely suffered under similar pressure, but he could not say with certainty when that reckoning might come. Eleanor found herself asking, somewhat hesitantly, whether she was in any danger herself, now that she understood the truth of what had happened. Carradine's expression grew more careful at that question, and he admitted he could not rule out the possibility entirely, though he believed her isolation at Ashcombe offered some measure of protection, provided she was careful about who she spoke to and what she revealed of what she now knew. He offered, somewhat awkwardly, to arrange for additional protection at the estate if she felt it necessary, though he was quick to add that the decision was entirely hers to make. She considered his offer for a long moment, weighing her natural instinct toward independence against the very real unease his warning had stirred in her. She told him she would think on it, though she admitted, more openly than she had intended, that his visits over the past few days had already made her feel less alone in facing all of this than she had expected to feel when she first arrived at Ashcombe. Carradine seemed genuinely moved by the admission, and for a moment the careful distance he usually maintained softened into something warmer. Their conversation shifted, gradually, away from Edmund and Langley, and the tangled danger surrounding them, into something quieter and more personal. Eleanor asked him, somewhat impulsively, what had drawn him to attend Edmund's wedding in the first place, given that he had described their acquaintance as distant rather than close. Carradine admitted, with a faint and unexpected smile, that he had actually come at his mother's insistence, she having decided it was long past time her son attended more social functions instead of secluding himself with business matters and quiet evenings at home. He confessed he had very nearly declined the invitation entirely and found himself, even now, uncertain whether to be grateful or troubled that he had not. Eleanor found herself smiling at that, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in days, and asked what exactly he meant by uncertain. Carradine hesitated, choosing his words with obvious care, before admitting that had he not attended that wedding, he would never have witnessed her composure in the face of such public humiliation, and would never have felt compelled to ensure she learned the truth of what had happened to her. He did not elaborate further, though something in his tone suggested there was more beneath the simple explanation than he was prepared to say outright. The conversation lingered a while longer, drifting into easier topics, the history of Ashcombe itself, Carradine's own family estate in the north, small observations about the countryside that had nothing to do with danger or scandal. Eleanor found herself relaxing in his company in a way she had not expected, given the circumstances under which they had met. There was something steady about him, a quality she had not often encountered among the fashionable young men she had known in London, most of whom seemed more concerned with appearances than substance. When he finally rose to leave, promising to write again the moment he learned anything new, Eleanor walked him to the door herself, aware of a small reluctance in seeing him go that she chose not to examine too carefully. He paused on the threshold, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite name, then thanked her for allowing him into her home despite everything, and told her he hoped she would consider his offer of additional protection, if only for her own peace of mind. Beatrice appeared shortly after Carradine's departure, carrying a fresh pot of tea and a look of poorly concealed curiosity that Eleanor pretended not to notice. Beatrice had known her since childhood, and had a way of asking questions without quite asking them, hovering near the doorway with the tea tray until Eleanor finally invited her to sit. Eleanor found herself sharing more than she had intended, not the details of Langley or the danger surrounding Edmund, which felt too heavy and too dangerous to speak of, even to someone she trusted completely, but the simpler truth of how unexpectedly comfortable she had felt in the Duke's company. Beatrice listened with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had watched her mistress endure a very public heartbreak only weeks earlier, and though she said little, Eleanor could see the cautious hope in her expression. Beatrice reminded her gently that trust, once broken so completely, was not always easy to extend again, and that it would do no harm to take things slowly, whatever these things were. Eleanor agreed readily enough, though she privately admitted to herself that slowness had already proven difficult, given how quickly her thoughts kept returning to the man who had just left. She spent part of the afternoon walking the garden alone, turning the day's conversation over in her mind. She thought of how differently Carradine had behaved compared to every other gentleman she had known in London, men who filled silences with empty compliments and spoke mostly of themselves. Carradine, by contrast, seemed to choose his words carefully, offering little more than what was true, and somehow that restraint made the moments when he did reveal something of himself feel far more significant than any practiced flattery ever could. She reminded herself, firmly, that it had been less than 2 weeks since her own wedding had collapsed in front of half of London, and that whatever warmth she felt toward Carradine's steady presence was likely nothing more than gratitude for a friendly face in an otherwise frightening situation. It was a reasonable explanation, and she repeated it to herself several times throughout the afternoon, though it did little to quiet the small, persistent flutter she felt whenever she recalled the particular way he had looked at her before climbing back into his carriage. She watched his carriage disappear down the long gravel drive, the afternoon light beginning to soften into evening, and found herself standing at the doorway longer than necessary, turning over everything that had passed between them. Whatever she had expected when she fled London a week and a half earlier, it had not been this, a tangled mystery of debts and danger, and a duke who seemed determined to see her safely through it, for reasons she was not entirely certain she understood, and was not entirely certain she wanted to question too closely just yet. That evening, over a simple supper in the small dining room, Eleanor found herself thinking again about Edmund, though the anger she had once carried so sharply had settled into something quieter and more resigned. She wondered whether he would ever gather the courage to return to London and face Langley's threat directly, or whether he intended to spend the rest of his life running from town to town under false names, always looking over his shoulder. She realized, somewhat to her own surprise, that she genuinely hoped he found some way to resolve the danger he was in, not because she wished to reconcile with him, that possibility felt entirely closed to her now, but simply because she no longer wished him harm, whatever damage his choices had caused her. She thought, too, about what her life might look like in the months ahead. She had come to Ashcombe intending to disappear quietly until London's gossip moved on to some fresher scandal, yet the events of the past 2 weeks had made that plan feel increasingly unrealistic. If Langley's activities eventually drew the attention of the authorities, as Carradine believed they would, her own name might become entangled in the resulting scrutiny, whether she wished it or not. She was no longer certain that a quiet retreat to the countryside would be enough to keep her sheltered from whatever came next. Yet strangely, the uncertainty did not frighten her as much as she might have expected. She found herself thinking of Carradine's steady presence throughout the unfolding situation, the way he had traveled 2 days out of his way simply to ensure she was not left in ignorance, and the careful, deliberate manner in which he had shared even the most difficult parts of what he had learned. Whatever came next, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing it, and there was a strange comfort in that realization, one she had not expected to find so soon after the humiliation of her own wedding day. That evening, as she sat once again by her window overlooking the pond, she found her thoughts circling not around Edmund or Langley, but around the quiet warmth in Carradine's voice when he had spoken of attending that wedding, and the way his careful composure had softened, just slightly, in her presence. It was a strange thing to notice, given everything else occupying her mind, yet she could not quite push the observation away, and she fell asleep that night with far more on her mind than the danger she now knew surrounded her. Carradine became a regular presence at Ashcombe over the following 2 weeks, arriving every few days with news, however small, and staying longer each time despite his earlier promises not to overstay his welcome. Eleanor found she no longer minded the interruptions to her solitude. If anything, she found herself listening for the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, with an eagerness she would have found embarrassing to admit aloud. The news he brought was not always encouraging. Langley's activities, it seemed, ran deeper than either of them had first suspected, touching several families across London whose sons or brothers had found themselves similarly indebted and similarly silenced. Carradine's contacts had begun compiling evidence, quietly, careful not to alert Langley to how much was already known, but progress was slow, and the danger of exposure before the authorities were ready to act remained a constant concern. Edmund himself remained in hiding, still refusing to return to London despite Carradine's continued urging through intermediaries. Eleanor found she thought of him less often now, her sympathy for his fear tempered by a growing frustration at his continued unwillingness to face the consequences of his choices, whatever they had cost him personally. She had begun to build a life at Ashcombe that no longer revolved around the wound he had left her with, and she found she preferred it that way. Her days took on a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent tending the garden, which had begun to flourish under her care despite the lateness of the season, and afternoons were often spent with Carradine, whether walking the estate grounds or sitting in the small sitting room discussing matters both serious and trivial. She learned, gradually, more about the man beneath the composed exterior he presented to the world. He told her of his childhood, marked by the difficulties his family had faced under Langley's earlier influence, and of the years he had spent afterward rebuilding both his family's fortune and his own guarded nature, wary of trusting easily after watching how quickly circumstances could turn against even the most careful families. She found herself sharing more of herself in turn than she had originally intended, speaking of her mother's early death, of the quiet loneliness that had followed despite her father's genuine affection, and of the hope she had placed, perhaps too completely, in her engagement to Edmund, as a chance to build a family of her own after years of managing her father's household alone. Carradine listened to these confidences with the same careful attention he gave to matters of danger and strategy, never rushing her, never offering empty comfort, simply present in a way she had not experienced with anyone before. It was on a cool afternoon, walking along the woodland path at the edge of the estate, that their conversation shifted into territory neither of them had directly acknowledged before. Eleanor had been describing her plans for the garden come spring, imagining beds of flowers where only weeds currently grew, when Carradine stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression more serious than their light conversation warranted. He told her, somewhat abruptly, that he had not originally intended to involve himself so deeply in her situation. He had come to Ashcombe that first day intending only to deliver a warning and return to London, believing his obligation to her ended there. Yet he found himself returning again and again, not merely out of concern for her safety regarding Langley, but because he had come to genuinely enjoy her company, in a way he had not experienced with anyone in a very long time. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the direct honesty of his admission. She had suspected, in quiet moments over the past 2 weeks, that something beyond simple obligation drew him back to Ashcombe so frequently, yet hearing him state it plainly left her uncertain how to respond. She reminded him, gently, that it had been barely a month since her own wedding had ended so publicly and so painfully, and that she was not certain she trusted her own judgment regarding matters of the heart just yet, given how completely she had misjudged Edmund's character. Carradine nodded slowly, accepting her hesitation without argument, though something in his expression suggested disappointment carefully controlled. He told her he understood, and that he had not spoken to pressure her into any response she was not ready to give, only that he had felt it dishonest to continue visiting so frequently without acknowledging, at least to her, what truly motivated his return trips beyond concern for Langley's threat. They continued walking in a silence that felt heavier than their earlier conversation, and Eleanor found herself turning his words over carefully in her mind. She was not, she realized, entirely opposed to what he had suggested, however cautious her instincts remained after Edmund's betrayal. There was something different about Carradine, a steadiness she had never found in Edmund even during the years she had known him, a willingness to be direct rather than hiding behind charm and empty promises. Yet she also recognized the danger of moving too quickly, of allowing gratitude for his kindness during a difficult time to be mistaken for something deeper before she had truly given herself time to heal. She told him, eventually, that she valued his honesty and that she was not indifferent to what he had said, but that she needed time before she could offer any answer beyond that. Carradine accepted this readily, telling her he had no intention of pressing her further, and that he would continue visiting as often as circumstances allowed, whether or not she ever came to feel toward him as he apparently felt toward her. The admission, offered without any hint of resentment or impatience, did more to ease her uncertainty than any grand declaration could have. Over the following days, their dynamic shifted subtly, an unspoken awareness now present beneath even their most ordinary conversations. Eleanor found herself noticing small things she had not paid attention to before, the way Carradine's expression softened whenever she laughed at some observation he made, the careful attention he paid to her comfort during their walks, always positioning himself to shield her from the wind, without ever remarking on the gesture directly. She began to understand that his earlier reputation for keeping to himself, avoiding the social gatherings that consumed so much of London's nobility, had less to do with coldness and more to do with a careful nature that revealed itself only gradually, to those patient enough to earn it. News arrived one afternoon that complicated matters further. A letter reached Ashcombe from Eleanor's father, forwarded through Beatrice's sister in London, informing her that rumors had begun circulating through society regarding her sudden departure from the city. Some whispered that she had fled in shame, unable to face the humiliation of her cancelled wedding. Others, more troublingly, had begun speculating about her connection to the Duke of Carradine, whose own absence from London social events had been noted and connected, however loosely, to rumors of visits to a remote country estate. Eleanor read the letter with a sinking feeling, aware that whatever privacy she and Carradine had enjoyed at Ashcombe was beginning to erode under the weight of London's relentless curiosity. She showed the letter to Carradine on his next visit, watching his expression carefully as he read through her father's careful, worried words. He was quiet for a long moment afterward, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a new gravity she had not heard from him before. He told her that whatever rumors were circulating, he had no intention of allowing them to damage her reputation further, regardless of what that might mean for his own standing in society. He suggested, carefully, that the situation might soon require decisions neither of them had anticipated needing to make so quickly, decisions about whether to remain hidden at Ashcombe indefinitely, or to return to London and face whatever awaited them there directly, together, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to shape the story in their absence. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over her again. The fragile peace she had built at Ashcombe now threatened not by Langley's danger directly, but by the simple, unavoidable reality that the world beyond the estate's quiet borders had not forgotten her, and would not continue to leave her undisturbed forever. She looked at Carradine, standing steady and serious before her, and found herself, despite everything, grateful that whatever decisions lay ahead, she would not be facing them entirely alone. That night, after Carradine had returned to the village inn, Eleanor sat with Beatrice in the small parlor, the letter from her father spread open on the table between them. Beatrice read through it a second time, her brow furrowed with concern, and asked Eleanor plainly what she intended to do. Eleanor admitted she did not yet know, though the thought of returning to London, of walking into a ballroom and facing the same faces that had watched her stand alone at the altar, filled her with a dread she had not fully anticipated having to confront again so soon. Beatrice, ever practical, pointed out that hiding at Ashcombe indefinitely was unlikely to solve the underlying problem. Rumors, once started, rarely faded on their own, and the longer Eleanor remained absent and unexplained, the more elaborate the stories about her disappearance were likely to become. Better, Beatrice suggested, to control the narrative herself, rather than allow London's gossips to write it for her. Eleanor recognized the wisdom in this, even as she resisted the idea of returning before she felt ready. She spent the following days turning the question over in her mind while continuing her usual routine, though with less of the peaceful absorption she had felt in the garden during earlier weeks. She found herself watching the road more often, half expecting further letters bearing worse news, and sleeping less soundly than she had since first arriving at Ashcombe. The estate, once her sanctuary, now felt less like a permanent refuge and more like a pause before some larger decision she could not indefinitely postpone. Carradine returned 2 days later with additional news, some of it encouraging. His contacts had made further progress in documenting Langley's activities, enough that they believed formal action against him might be possible within a matter of weeks rather than months. He told her that once Langley's operations were exposed and dismantled, much of the dangers surrounding Edmund, and by extension surrounding her own association with the matter, would likely dissolve along with it. The rumors regarding her broken engagement might still linger, but the more serious threat would no longer hang over her decisions. This news brought Eleanor a measure of relief, though it did little to resolve the more immediate question of how to handle the growing speculation already circulating through London society. She asked Carradine directly what he thought she should do, and he was careful, as he so often was, not to tell her what to decide but rather to lay out the considerations as he saw them. Returning to London now, before Langley's threat was fully resolved, carried its own risks. Remaining at Ashcombe indefinitely risked allowing the rumors to grow unchecked in her absence. There was no option entirely free of difficulty, only a choice about which difficulty she preferred to face. She appreciated, more than she said aloud, that he did not attempt to make the decision for her, despite how easily he could have used his position and his obvious feelings toward her to press for whichever outcome suited him best. Instead, he treated her judgment as something to be respected rather than managed, a quality she had rarely encountered among the men in her life, including, she now recognized with some discomfort, Edmund himself, who had made the most significant decision of their shared future entirely without consulting her at all. That evening, walking alone through the garden after Carradine had departed, Eleanor found herself thinking of the woman she had been before the wedding, eager and trusting, certain that her future had already been decided, and required nothing more from her than showing up to claim it. She was no longer that woman, she realized, and she was not entirely certain whether to mourn the loss of that simpler self, or to feel grateful for the clearer, more cautious understanding she had gained in its place. Whatever she decided about returning to London, she intended to make the choice as someone who understood her own mind, rather than someone simply reacting to circumstances imposed upon her by others. She thought too about Carradine's careful admission from days earlier, and found that her hesitation had softened somewhat with time, though she was not yet ready to voice any change in her feelings aloud. There was still a caution in her, born of Edmund's betrayal, that made her reluctant to trust too quickly or too completely. Yet she recognized, walking alone beneath the darkening sky, that the caution she felt toward Carradine was different in quality from the wariness she still carried toward the idea of marriage itself. It was not doubt about his character that held her back, but simple fear of being hurt again, a fear she suspected only time and continued honesty on his part could ease. The following week brought a change in the weather, the last mild days of autumn giving way to sharper winds and colder mornings. Eleanor found herself spending more time indoors, though Carradine's visits continued undiminished, the two of them now often sitting together by the fire in the small parlor rather than walking the grounds. Their conversations grew easier during these quieter hours, less burdened by the weight of Langley's threat and more focused on ordinary matters, books they had both read, memories from childhood, small opinions about the world that revealed more of their characters than either of them perhaps intended. She began to notice how naturally he fit into the rhythm of her days at Ashcombe, how the house itself seemed less empty and echoing when he was present within it. Beatrice, too, had grown fond of him, though she remained carefully watchful, a guardian of Eleanor's well-being who was not about to let her affection for Carradine's evident kindness override her duty to protect her mistress from further heartbreak. Eleanor found some comfort in Beatrice's vigilance, knowing that if Carradine's intentions were anything other than genuine, Beatrice would be among the first to notice and to say so plainly. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the windows, Carradine asked her, gently, whether she had given any further thought to her feelings, or whether he was still to understand her earlier hesitation as her final answer. Eleanor considered the question carefully before responding, unwilling to offer either false certainty or continued avoidance. She told him that her feelings had indeed shifted over the weeks of his visits, that she found herself looking forward to his arrivals with an eagerness she could no longer pretend was merely gratitude, yet she remained cautious about how quickly to trust those feelings, given how recently her judgment had failed her so completely with Edmund. Carradine listened to this with evident patience, and when she finished, he told her simply that he was willing to wait as long as she needed, that he had no interest in rushing her into anything before she felt ready, and that her honesty meant more to him than any premature declaration ever could. It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the kind of response she might have hoped for from a man who genuinely respected her, rather than simply desiring an outcome that suited his own wishes, and she felt, in that quiet moment by the fire, the last of her deepest hesitation begin to ease. The letter that changed everything arrived on a gray morning nearly a month after Eleanor had first come to Ashcombe. It was from Carradine, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the night, and the urgency in his handwriting was evident before Eleanor had even broken the seal. Langley had been arrested. The evidence Carradine's contacts had gathered over the past weeks had finally been enough to convince the authorities to act, and Langley now sat in custody while investigators worked to untangle the full extent of his network. The letter went on to explain that Edmund had returned to London on his own accord just days before the arrest, apparently having found the courage, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of running, to face the situation directly. His testimony had proven valuable in securing Langley's arrest, and while his reputation would likely never fully recover from the scandal of his abandoned wedding, he would at least no longer be forced to live in hiding, fearing for his safety. Carradine asked her to meet him at the village inn that afternoon, promising to explain everything further in person, and closing the letter with words that made Eleanor's breath catch, telling her that with the danger now resolved, he hoped they might finally speak plainly about what came next, without the shadow of Langley's threat hanging over every conversation. She dressed quickly, her hands unsteady with a mixture of relief and anticipation, and made her way to the village with Beatrice trailing behind her, equally eager for news. She found Carradine waiting in the same dining room where he had first laid out the full truth of Edmund's disappearance, though his expression today held none of the careful gravity from that earlier conversation. Instead, there was a lightness in him she had not seen before, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. He confirmed everything the letter had described, adding details his contacts had shared regarding the scale of Langley's operations, far larger than either of them had initially suspected, touching families across London in ways that would likely take months to fully untangle. Yet the danger, at least the immediate danger that had shadowed Eleanor and Edmund both, was now resolved. Langley would face justice for his actions, and the fear that had driven Edmund into hiding no longer had any hold over him. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her chest that she had not fully realized she had been carrying. For weeks she had held herself carefully, aware that danger might still be lurking somewhere beyond Ashcomb's quiet borders, and the sudden absence of that fear left her feeling almost lightheaded with relief. She asked about Edmund, whether he intended to remain in London or retreat somewhere quieter himself, given the scandal that would surely follow him regardless of his cooperation with authorities. Carradine told her that Edmund had expressed a wish to speak with her directly, if she was willing, to offer an apology in person for the pain his silence had caused her. Eleanor considered this request carefully. Part of her wanted nothing more to do with the man who had left her standing alone at that altar. Yet another part of her recognized that hearing him explain himself directly, now that the full truth was known, might offer a kind of closure she had not realized she still needed. She agreed, cautiously, to meet with Edmund once, provided the meeting took place at a time and place of her choosing, and provided Carradine remained nearby, a request she made partly for practical reasons and partly, she admitted silently to herself, because she had grown accustomed to his steady presence during difficult moments. Carradine agreed readily, and arrangements were made for Edmund to travel to the village within the week. The meeting, when it finally happened, took place in the same sitting room at Ashcombe where Eleanor had first invited Carradine into her home. Edmund arrived looking thinner and more haggard than she remembered, the weeks of hiding and fear having clearly taken their toll on him. He apologized immediately upon seeing her, his voice unsteady, explaining in halting words how deeply he regretted the manner in which he had left her, even as he tried to explain the fear that had driven him to such a drastic and cowardly choice. Eleanor listened without interrupting, watching the man she had once believed she would spend her life with stumble through an explanation that, however genuine, could never fully erase the humiliation she had endured because of his silence. When he finished, she told him plainly that she understood the fear he had faced, and that she no longer carried the same anger toward him she had felt in the weeks immediately following the wedding. But understanding was not the same as forgiveness, not entirely, and she told him honestly that she did not believe their acquaintance could ever return to what it had once been, not after everything that had happened between them. Edmund accepted this with a kind of resigned acceptance, telling her he had not truly expected anything else, only that he had needed to offer his apology in person, whatever she chose to do with it. He wished her well, genuinely it seemed, and expressed something close to relief upon noticing the quiet way Carradine positioned himself near the doorway throughout their conversation, as though understanding without needing to be told that Eleanor had found, in the aftermath of his own failure, someone far more deserving of her trust. After Edmund departed, Eleanor sat quietly in the sitting room for a long while, processing the strange finality of the conversation. Whatever remained of her old life in London, the version of herself who had once planned a future alongside Edmund Fairweather, felt entirely closed now, a chapter finished rather than simply abandoned. Carradine remained nearby throughout, not pressing her to speak before she was ready, simply present in the way she had come to rely upon over the past weeks. When she finally did speak, it was to tell him that she felt, for the first time since that terrible morning at the church, genuinely free of the weight she had been carrying. Carradine's expression softened at this, and he asked, carefully, whether that freedom left room for the conversation he had hoped to have with her, once Langley's threat was finally resolved. Eleanor smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she had given him since his very first visit to Ashcombe, and told him she believed it did. He spoke plainly then, without the careful hesitation that had marked his earlier admissions. He told her that his feelings toward her had only grown stronger over the weeks of visiting Ashcombe, that he had come to admire not only her composure in the face of humiliation, but her strength in rebuilding a life for herself in the aftermath, and her willingness to face danger and uncertainty with clear eyes, rather than retreating into fear. He told her he did not wish to rush her into any decision she was not ready to make, but that he wanted her to know, plainly and honestly, that his intentions toward her were genuine, and that he hoped, in time, she might consider a future alongside him, built on honesty rather than the empty promises that had failed her before. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, though for the first time in weeks they were tears of something closer to hope than grief. She told him that she too had come to feel something real growing between them over the past month, something built slowly and carefully, rather than the swift, uncomplicated affection she had once mistaken for lasting love with Edmund. She was not ready, she admitted, to rush into any formal arrangement so soon after everything that had happened, but she told him she wanted to continue what had begun between them, openly now, without pretense or careful distance. Carradine reached for her hand then, the first deliberate touch he had allowed himself since their acquaintance began, and Eleanor did not pull away. They sat together as the afternoon light faded into evening, speaking of a future neither of them fully knew yet, but which both of them, for the first time in a long while, felt genuinely hopeful about facing. In the weeks that followed, word of Langley's arrest spread through London, and with it, the true story behind Edmund's disappearance began to circulate, softening much of the harsher gossip that had followed Eleanor's abandoned wedding. She found she no longer feared returning to the city, though she was in no particular hurry to do so, content for the time being to remain at Ashcombe, tending her garden and building, slowly and deliberately, a life she had chosen for herself, rather than one simply handed to her by circumstance. Her father wrote to her again that winter, this time with none of the worried caution of his earlier letters, delighted instead to hear that his daughter had found happiness after such a difficult beginning to the year. He asked, gently, whether she intended to return to London for the season, and Eleanor found herself considering the question seriously for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe. She was no longer the woman who needed to hide from the city's judgment, but she also recognized that Ashcombe had become something more than a temporary refuge. It had become, in its own quiet way, home. She spoke to Carradine about her father's letter one evening, curious to hear his thoughts on the matter. He told her honestly that he had no strong preference either way, that his own estate in the north offered its own quiet beauty, but that he understood if she wished to remain closer to Ashcombe, given everything the house had come to mean to her over the past months. He suggested, carefully, that perhaps a compromise might suit them both, dividing time between the city and the countryside as circumstances allowed, rather than choosing one life entirely over the other. Eleanor found she liked this idea considerably. She had spent so many weeks believing she would have to choose between hiding away forever or facing London's judgment head-on, and it had not occurred to her until Carradine suggested it that perhaps she did not need to choose so absolutely at all. She could return to the city on her own terms, when she wished, and retreat to the quiet of Ashcombe whenever the noise of society grew too much to bear. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like a future shaped by her own choices rather than circumstances imposed upon her. News continued to arrive from London throughout the winter regarding Langley's trial, which proceeded slowly but steadily toward what most believed would be a conviction severe enough to ensure he could never again threaten young men of good family into desperate silence. Edmund's testimony had proven crucial to the case, and though his own reputation remained tarnished by the scandal of his abandoned wedding, there was a growing sense among London's more reasonable circles that he had, in the end, shown a kind of courage in returning to face the consequences of his earlier cowardice. Eleanor found she could think of him now without the sharp sting of betrayal that had once accompanied every memory of their engagement. He had made a terrible choice in leaving her the way he had, but she understood now, more fully than she had allowed herself to during those first raw weeks, that fear could drive even fundamentally decent people toward choices they would otherwise never have made. She did not excuse what he had done, but she found she could, at last, release the anger she had carried, choosing instead to focus on the life she was building, rather than the one that had fallen apart in front of her. Carradine continued his visits, each one bringing them closer, until the quiet understanding between them grew into something neither of them felt any need to hide. Eleanor often thought back to that terrible morning at the church, the humiliation she had believed would define the rest of her life, and found she could hardly recognize the woman she had been that day. She had come to Ashcombe seeking only to disappear, to escape the shame of a wedding that never happened, and had found instead a strength in herself she had not known she possessed, and a man whose steady, honest presence had helped her rebuild not just her sense of safety, but her belief that trust, given carefully and to the right person, could still be worth the risk. By early spring, the garden at Ashcombe had transformed entirely. The roses Eleanor had once found tangled and overgrown now blooming in careful rows she had tended herself through the long winter months. Carradine had proposed to her on one of the first warm evenings of the season, not in some grand gesture before an audience, but quietly, beside the pond where she had first cried on her arrival, asking her plainly if she would consider spending her life alongside him, built on the honesty and patience that had defined their acquaintance from the very beginning. She had accepted without hesitation the caution that had once guarded her heart so carefully having given way, over months of steady proof, to a certainty she had never expected to feel again after Edmund's betrayal. Their engagement, when announced, drew considerably more attention from London society than either of them might have wished, given the dramatic circumstances that had first brought them together. Yet Eleanor found she no longer feared the whispers and speculation the way she once had. She had faced far greater difficulty than gossip over the past year, and had emerged from it stronger rather than diminished. Her father traveled to Ashcombe himself for the occasion, delighted beyond measure to see his daughter settled with a man he clearly respected, and the wedding that followed, held quietly at Ashcombe rather than in the grand cathedral where her first attempt had ended in humiliation, felt entirely different in character. There were no crowds of curious onlookers, no pressure to perform happiness for an audience more interested in spectacle than sincerity. Only close family and a handful of trusted friends gathered in the very garden Eleanor had brought back to life with her own hands, witnessing a promise made not out of obligation or social expectation, but out of genuine choice. Beatrice stood nearby throughout the ceremony, tears of happiness rather than worry finally filling her eyes as she watched the woman she had cared for since childhood finally find the steady, honest love she deserved. Eleanor caught her eye at one point during the vows and felt a rush of gratitude for the loyal companion who had followed her into uncertain exile without hesitation, and who had witnessed, more closely than anyone, the long journey from that terrible morning at the church to this quiet, joyful afternoon in the garden. As the sun began to set over Ashcombe that evening, casting the same warm amber light across the estate that had greeted Eleanor on her very first arrival nearly a year earlier, she found herself standing once again near the pond, this time with Carradine beside her rather than alone. She thought of the frightened, humiliated woman who had once sat crying at this very spot, uncertain whether she would ever recover from the shame of that abandoned wedding, and felt an overwhelming gratitude for everything that had unfolded since. The altar she had once fled from had led her, through danger and uncertainty and slow, careful trust, to exactly the life she had once feared she would never find. Whatever came next, she would face it not as a woman running from her past, but as one walking, deliberately and with clear eyes, toward a future she had finally chosen for herself, with the man who had followed her all the way to a remote country estate, and stayed. A year after the wedding at Ashcombe, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching morning light spill across a room that had once belonged to storage trunks and forgotten furniture. It had taken months of careful work to transform the space, but she had insisted on doing much of it herself, just as she had once restored the gardens below, finding a particular satisfaction in making something neglected feel loved again. Carradine found her there, as he often did in quiet moments, and joined her at the window overlooking the very pond where their courtship had unfolded so carefully the year before. Their daughter would arrive by summer, the physician had told them, and Eleanor found herself thinking often these days of the woman she had been when she first came to Ashcombe, frightened and humiliated, certain her life had ended before it had truly begun. She could hardly reconcile that memory with the contentment she felt now, standing beside a husband who had never once made her doubt his steadiness, in a home that had become entirely her own. London society had long since moved on from the scandal of her broken engagement, distracted by fresher gossip as society always was, though occasionally she still heard whispers about the dramatic circumstances of her courtship with the Duke of Carradine, softened now into something closer to romantic legend than scandal. She found she did not mind the stories people told, however exaggerated some had become in the retelling. The truth, she knew, was stranger and more difficult than any drawing-room gossip could capture, and she was content to let London believe whatever version suited its taste for drama, while she and Carradine simply lived the quieter, truer story together. Edmund had written to her twice since his testimony against Langley, brief letters informing her of his decision to leave London entirely and settle in a quieter corner of the country, far from the society that had once defined his ambitions. He had married eventually, a woman Eleanor had never met, and seemed, from what little she could gather through the careful distance of correspondence, to have found some measure of peace after everything that had happened. She wished him well genuinely, without lingering bitterness, grateful in a strange way that his cowardice, however painful at the time, had ultimately led her toward a life far better than the one she had originally planned. Langley's trial had concluded the previous spring, resulting in a conviction severe enough to ensure he would trouble no other families the way he had troubled Edmund and so many others. Carradine's family, and several others who had suffered under his influence over the years, finally saw some measure of justice restored, and the network of fear he had built through careful threats and quiet blackmail collapsed entirely once his hold on his victims was broken. Carradine spoke of it rarely now, the old wound from his father's dealings with Langley finally beginning to heal alongside the newer, brighter chapters of his life. Beatrice had remained with them, though her role had shifted gradually from lady's maid to something closer to a trusted friend and household manager, overseeing Ashcombe's daily affairs with the same brisk efficiency she had brought to those first uncertain days of restoring the neglected estate. She had married the previous autumn, a quiet ceremony in the village church, to a local farmer named Edward who had courted her patiently over many months, and Eleanor had been genuinely delighted to stand beside her at the small celebration that followed, grateful to see her loyal companion find her own happiness after years of devoted service to others. The estate itself had flourished under Eleanor's careful attention, the gardens now full and vibrant through every season, the house restored to a warmth it had not known since her aunt's passing years earlier. Carradine had suggested, more than once, that they might spend more time at his own family estate in the north, given its greater size and grander history, but Eleanor had always gently declined, unwilling to leave the place that had given her shelter during the darkest weeks of her life, and where she had first discovered the strength to build a future entirely her own. They did travel to London occasionally, for matters of business or the rare social obligation neither could avoid, and Eleanor found she no longer felt the old dread that had once accompanied any thought of the city. She walked through its streets now with the quiet confidence of a woman who had survived its harshest judgment and emerged stronger for it, no longer defined by the humiliation of an empty altar, but by everything she had built afterward, through patience and honesty, and a willingness to trust again despite every reason not to. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the estate lay peaceful beneath the darkening sky, Eleanor and Carradine often sat together in the same small parlor where their careful courtship had first taken shape, speaking of small ordinary matters that carried a weight neither of them had expected from such simple domestic happiness. She would sometimes catch him watching her with the same steady attention he had shown from the very back pew of that church. So long ago now it felt like a story that had happened to someone else entirely, and she would smile, remembering how far they had both traveled since that terrible, transformative morning. She thought, on one such evening, of writing down the full story someday, not for London's gossips to devour and distort further, but simply for her own daughter, so that she might understand someday how her parents had found each other amid danger and heartbreak, and how a life interrupted so painfully could still, with patience and courage, be rebuilt into something far better than what had been lost. It was not the story she had once imagined for herself, standing nervous and hopeful at the top of that church aisle a year and a half earlier, but she had come to understand that the stories we do not choose can sometimes lead us toward exactly where we were always meant to be. Her father visited often that year, delighting in his granddaughter's approaching arrival with a warmth that had softened him considerably since the anxious, uncertain man who had once tried to talk Eleanor out of fleeing to the countryside. He had grown genuinely close to Carradine over the months, the two men often disappearing into long conversations about business and estate matters that left Eleanor amused at how thoroughly her husband had won over a father who had once worried, quietly, that his daughter might never recover her trust in any man again. She watched them sometimes from across the room, her father's laughter carrying easily now in a way it rarely had during those difficult weeks after her broken engagement, and felt a fresh wave of gratitude for how completely their lives had healed. Margaret, the shopkeeper from the village who had asked no prying questions during Eleanor's first uncertain weeks at Ashcombe, remained a familiar and welcome presence in her life, the two women having grown into an easy friendship over the passing seasons. Margaret often remarked, with the particular bluntness of someone who had known Eleanor before anyone in the village understood who she truly was, that she had suspected from the very first visit that Eleanor possessed a quiet strength most young ladies of fashion never had reason to discover in themselves. Eleanor had laughed at this the first time she heard it, though she had come to believe there was real truth in the observation, understanding now that the woman who had once wept alone by a garden pond had carried more resilience within her than she had recognized at the time. The nursery grew ready through the following weeks, filled gradually with small clothes and a cradle that had once belonged to Carradine's own mother, passed down now to the next generation with a care that spoke of a family finally free from the shadow that had haunted it for so many years. The beacon went off at 07:43 station time, and every single screen in my office lit up at the same moment. Not one screen, not two, every screen, life, and found herself hoping, more than anything else, that her daughter would grow up understanding that setbacks, however devastating they felt in the moment, did not have to define the whole of a life that followed them. She thought sometimes of writing to Edmund one final time, not out of any lingering affection, but simply to tell him that she held no bitterness toward him any longer, that whatever pain his choices had caused her had ultimately led her toward a happiness she doubted she would have found any other way. She never quite managed to send such a letter, uncertain whether it would bring him comfort or merely reopen wounds better left closed, and eventually she let the impulse pass, content instead to simply wish him well in her own private thoughts whenever his name crossed her mind. As summer approached and her daughter's arrival grew closer, Eleanor found herself walking the garden paths more slowly than before, pausing often to rest beneath the old oak tree near the pond where she and Carradine had shared so many quiet conversations during their courtship. The roses bloomed fuller than ever that year, tended now by a small staff Eleanor had hired to help with the growing demands of the estate, though she still insisted on pruning the beds nearest the house herself, unwilling to fully surrender the labor that had once given her such purpose during her darkest weeks. Carradine often joined her on these slow walks, matching his pace patiently to hers, and Eleanor found herself thinking, more than once, how strange and wonderful it was that the very stranger who had watched her stand humiliated at an empty altar had become the steady center of the life she now lived. She no longer thought of that terrible morning as the defining tragedy of her existence, but simply as the beginning of an unexpected and difficult road that had, against every fear she carried at the time, led her exactly where she was meant to be. The candle in the parlor burned low as the evening deepened, and Carradine reached for her hand the way he had that first afternoon he finally spoke his feelings plainly, a gesture that had become as natural to them both as breathing. Outside, the gardens of Ashcombe lay quiet under the rising moon, the same grounds that had once felt like nothing more than a hiding place from shame, now simply home, filled with the steady, unremarkable happiness that Eleanor had once feared she would never know again after that empty altar had nearly convinced her that trust itself was not worth the risk.